Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. Happy New Year! This is my first video of 2021. In case you're new to this channel, allow me to introduce myself briefly. I'm a biologist. I do research in biology and I also teach biology in the university. And I've been teaching a biology of science fiction course, which really talks about my interest not only in the biological sciences but in popular culture, especially science fiction. And that's why it's great that I have this outlet for the many interests that I have, not only in those two things that I've mentioned, but in many, many different things, including anime, music, television series, RPGs, and many other stuff. So, PopScicle, this channel is all about discussing all of those, but with particular emphasis on the hybridization between popular culture and science and the many interesting things that you can find as overlaps between those two things. Now, in this particular episode, which is my first of 2021, I'll be talking a bit about the science fiction that I've seen in 2020. Now, 2020 would have been a very, very big year for science fiction if Dune had come out as scheduled. It was supposed to come out in 2020, particularly in December, and it was already being seen as potentially the Lord of the Rings of science fiction because it's really epic in scale. It's based, of course, on the book by Frank Herbert, a classic from the 1960s in science fiction, and it has assembled probably the biggest cast in history, led by Timothée Chalamet of Call Me by Your Name fame, but supported by a brilliant, great cast that has so many accolades among them. And so a lot of people, particularly science fiction fans like myself, were really looking forward to it. I teach a biology of science fiction course, as I said, and Dune, the novel, is one of the key references in that course, and so I was really looking forward to watching this movie with my students. Alas, COVID-19 happened, and of course a lot of terrible things have happened because of that, but Dune was one of the major casualties. Now we have to wait until October 2021 to see it. But that doesn't mean that 2020 didn't have some gems in the science fiction genre, particularly when we talk about cinema. This episode is going to be about cinema. I wish I could talk about a lot of science fiction in television and in literature because that's really where I'm starting from. As a teacher of that course, it's really literature that we discuss, not so much movies, although we do have some film examples like Arrival and Star Trek movies and series. However, it's really literature that we discuss in that course. Nevertheless, this year wasn't very friendly, not to the science fiction genre, because there was a lot of science fiction literature that was released even this year, I believe, but I wasn't able to partake of a lot of it given the situation, given the lockdown. I am a traditionalist when it comes to literature. I want to be holding a book in my hand, and I wasn't able to go to the bookstore to peruse the science fiction section as often as I would have liked to. And so I won't speak about that. For television series, I will talk about, I guess, Star Trek Discovery for quite a bit, although I will devote a special episode to the biology of that brilliant series. So, for this episode, I'm going to talk about mostly movies. And, like I said, Dune would have been the giant in the science fiction genre in this cinematic year of 2020. But we didn't have it. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have some good films in science fiction. So I'm going to mention a few things, a few films that I think I would be able to recommend to you. You've probably watched at least one of these 4 films that I'm going to highlight. And then I'm going to mention some that I haven't watched yet, but I'm planning to because of the praise that they've been getting from critics and from science fiction fans also. Now, there's probably very few common themes that you can use to relate all of the science fiction films that highlight this year. But if anything at all unites the three of the 4 films that I'm going to mention, it's about it's space, it's outer space, and the connectedness of people in a sense, The first film that I'm going to discuss that touches on outer space and exploration and all of that is something that starts off on a more positive note, somewhere at the near the start, and then of course in the middle, we begin to see that things are not as positive um, as some of the flashbacks would have suggested. But then ultimately, and this is the only spoilery thing that I'll say, ultimately the movie does end on a more hopeful note than you would come to expect, given what you begin to see um, uh, somewhere near the middle of the film. Of course, here I'm talking about The Midnight Sky, out on Netflix now, and this is probably the movie that you have seen. And this is based on the book Good Morning Midnight by Lily Brooks Dalton. It stars George Clooney, who's also the director of the film, and also Felicity Jones, David Oyelowo, and several other cast members. Now, I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that this is a film about finding a new home on another planet, but also about the destruction that human activity has been wreaking on the Earth. That's actually the most fascinating thing about the movie, aside from the acting by George Clooney and the score by Alexandre Desplat, which is fascinating, amazing. The juxtaposition between the impending doom of the Earth, which is never explained. That's one of the great things about it. There was never an exposition that sought out to explain what's going on to the Earth and the people on it. But there's that juxtaposition between the doom that's happening on Earth and the hope that is being presented by finding this new planet that could potentially be a new home for humans. And the film plays on that theme really well. There's a cloud of darkness and negativity and terror throughout the film because of the uncertainty of what's going on and what it will imply for human civilization as we know it, and then the lack of communication between the would-be pioneers on the new planet and the crew that is on its way back to Earth. Those are things that are heightened by the tension in the film, and excellently scored by Desplat, who is an Oscar winner for composing various films. The production design is top-notch. Actually, all of the technical things, including the design of the spaceship that the crew is using, and the visual effects are tremendous also. So in terms of technical aspects of the film, it's top-notch. The direction is also fine by George Clooney. I would say it's a must-watch film unless you're really after something that's very uplifting and very happy all throughout, which sci-fi rarely is, to be honest. But this one does have a rather uplifting end to it. I mean, it's not overly negative. But there are some questions raised which I will not go into right now because it will venture into spoilery territory as to the implications of what will happen to the human race after that ending. And so I invite you to watch that and think about it yourselves. But it is a finely crafted movie that I would recommend, especially because of its message about space exploration, terraforming a planet for occupancy by humans in the future, especially in the light of us, not taking care of our planet as well as we should. And it's a very timely message given what's happening now, because in a lot of ways, the pandemic that we are encountering right now is due to human activity, particularly wildlife consumption. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned about how we are interacting with the world that we have and how we are taking care of it or how we are abusing it, and what ultimately that will mean for our own future as a species. The second and third movies also touch on outer space, on what's out there, but they are both talking about something more external because they are both talking about extraterrestrial life out there. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler for either film, particularly for the film that's based on an H.P. Lovecraft story, so you probably already know what that one is. But I'd like to start with the other one first, and this is The Vast of Night. It's a great film set in the 1950s in suburbia in the US, and one of the most fascinating things about it is the cadence and the dialogue. That's very authentically 1950s suburbia US. Um, I mean, I'm a Filipino, so I never lived in the US, but I've seen enough of 1950s clips, historical clips and movies set in the 1950s to know how authentic the dialogue, the production design, the costume design uh, of the film is. And I really appreciated that. I also appreciated the shots that were made, and also the scoring, which was very, very effective. It used sounds that you would often associate with sci-fi that touches on outer space, the tingly sounds that are sometimes scary and bury under the skin. And so those were used to great effect. Two principal actors were great in their roles, especially when they were conversing in the cadence and dialogue of the 1950s. Um, Ultimately, this movie, which also invokes certain 1950s sci-fi series in the vein of Twilight Zone. Um, Very much is able to mine the tropes of science fiction that touches on alien life um, in a very tense way. There are many scenes where the tension is racked up by the music and by the acting and by silence even. There are many scenes where it's the silence that really racks up the tension, and the brilliant use of static and black and white and even darkness sometimes to emphasize that you have to listen to the radio message that's being transmitted instead of relying on your eyes. And so those were things that I really liked about that movie. Now again, without going too much into spoilery territory, ultimately it ends up not being as unique as I would have wanted it to be. The Until probably the last or the first, I mean, the first three-fourths of the movie, a lot about it made me expect that it was not going to end the way it ended. What do I mean by that? The first three-fourths made me think that it was going to be unlike any other science fiction alien movie that I had encountered, because there were so many new things about the way it was presented and so many creepy things. But ultimately, it's I wouldn't say that it failed to live up to expectations, because it was still a good film overall. But I would have probably preferred a less conventional ending. And that's all I'm going to say about it. Again, I would highly recommend watching this movie. If only so you could see how well made a sci-fi film could be, even with a low budget and with not very big actors, and staying true to the type of environment, its setting, which was 1950s again, 1950s suburban United States. There's a lot of creativity there, definitely, but I wish that creativity could have been taken all the way to the ending. And hopefully, I hope that I didn't spoil it too much by saying that. Now we go to the third film that I would like to highlight, and this is again about outer space, but this one is definitely more negative and more fearsome. And this one is a true sci-fi horror hybrid. This is the one based on the story of the same title by H.P. Lovecraft, and this is The Caller Out of Space. This Caller Out of Space is directed by Richard Stanley and stars Nicolas Cage, Jolie Richardson, and several other actors. Nicolas Cage is as bonkers as he usually is in this movie, and you can very well argue that his being bonkers, his natural state right now, is very fitting for the role, because there's a lot of craziness and zaniness and insanity going on, as you would come to expect if you've ever read an H.P. Lovecraft story, right? However, there are some scenes when he could have still dialed it down a bit, and it would have still been effective, or it would have been even more effective if he had done that. But hey, it's Nicolas Cage. We know what to expect now. He's bigger than life. We love him for how willing he is to be crazy. Anyone who has read the original short story would know the basic premise, wherein there's an entity that comes from outer space through a piece of rock that falls on the ground, and it begins to warp and mutate things around it, and also give the environment a strange color that is otherworldly, that cannot be described with the words that you can use usually to describe colors on Earth. So it's very sci-fi in that particular sense. It is alien sci-fi. The best thing about this is that it's probably the best H.P. Lovecraft interpretation in mainstream media that has come out in decades, maybe even ever. I make the qualification mainstream media because there was a Call of Cthulhu movie made by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, which I am a proud member of, by the way, which was excellent, but it was not really released wide, I believe. It was very, very faithful to the story. It was black and white. This one is also as faithful as, a mainstream US production could be. Didn't take too many liberties that were that deviated from the beauty of the original story, and it really got the Lovecraftian horror and the body horror that is necessary to evoke fear in the name of H.P. Lovecraft, honoring H.P. Lovecraft. And so I'm really, really excited about Richard Stanley's announcement that this is the first of a trilogy of H.P. Lovecraft films that he's making, the second one being the Dunwich Horror, which is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. Hopefully he'll make Shadow over Innsmouth next, because that's my favorite H.P. Lovecraft movie. But of course, Call of Cthulhu could make that, or At the Mountains of Madness, because I don't think Guillermo del Toro will still be making that as he had originally intended. But anyway, catch this film if you are a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, or if you are a fan of cosmic horror, which is the flavor of Lovecraft. If you're into weird science fiction horror hybrids, watch Color Out of Space. If you're not so turned off by Nicolas Cage, that is, because there's a lot of Nicolas Cage in this movie. And then finally, the fourth film that I would like to highlight is, of course, Tenet. I can't go with a discussion of science fiction in 2020 without discussing Tenet by Christopher Nolan. It is a well-made film overall in terms of technical quality. Yes, I did have the same issues as a lot of people with the sound design and how some of the dialogue was either muted or not as clear as it should have been. It's the Bane effect from The Dark Knight, I suppose. And it's a very intelligent script. It's a very intelligent screenplay or intelligent plot, as we have come to expect from Christopher Nolan. However, many of the techniques used in terms of progressing the plot were overly complicated. This is coming from someone who has watched a lot of science fiction, who has been reading a lot of science fiction, who has a science degree. It is too complicated. I admit to getting lost in a certain critical part of the film where I should have been able to follow everything that was going on because it was so crucial to the plot. I got lost. I got the main gist of it, of course, what it was trying to say, but how it was delivered distracted me so much because I was trying to make sense of it. Although, to be fair, the film itself said, through the character of Clemence Posey, who was in the Harry Potter films as Fleur Delacour, she said, don't try to make sense of it. And that was probably Christopher Nolan telling his viewers, don't try to make too much sense of this because it will give you a headache. That's a mistake I made. I tried to make too much sense of it, and so I did get a headache of sorts. And so there were certain parts where I got lost and didn't enjoy it as much as I would have wanted. But I do appreciate what it was trying to say. It's such a novel plot device, okay, what it used, which is the reverse the reversed weaponry, weapons that go back in time. Eventually, a machine that could bring people back in time. And okay, I won't I won't try to explain it. You watch it. for yourselves. If you've watched it and you understood 100% of it, good for you. Good for you. Don't worry, I'm secure enough in my intelligence to not feel threatened. But I won't hesitate to admit that I got lost, because I do believe that it could have been done in a much simpler manner that could have been still very effective in telling what it wanted to tell. You know, the best science fiction literature doesn't have to be, and didn't have to be, I mean, the existing ones didn't have to be overly complicated. In fact, some of the best ones are very straightforward in terms of their presentation of the plot. Christopher Nolan has always been known to take things to another level, I would say. Still, having said that, I believe Tenet is worth watching. It deserves its place in the top 10 for a lot of critics. But yeah, honestly, I wish that part, which I will not tell, but it's the climax of the movie. I wish it were delivered in a simpler way, or actually not just the climax, but the main thingamajig, the timey-wimey, borrowing a term from Doctor Who, and it would have been still as effective or even more so for a lot of people watching it. Now, those are just 4 films. I will not make any pretension at having watched all major science fiction films. For example, there's Bacurau, which is a Portuguese film, was released initially in 2019 but saw a wider release in 2020, and critics are raving about it. I haven't seen it, but I plan to rectify that soon. Also, there's Sea Fever, which is a film about the deep sea, and I'm very intrigued about it, being a marine biologist by training. So I am planning to watch it also, and I'm going to talk about these films in future episodes when I do get to watch them. But I believe that even having not watched those 2 films and some other science fiction movies, those are the 4 films that I would like to highlight. The Invisible Man, which is another hybrid of science fiction and horror, is another good film that came out in 2020, and I would recommend it, if only to be able to watch the great acting performance by Elizabeth Moss, who is always a reliable actress. But I wish there were more sci-fi, and of course, I wish we had been able to watch Dune. Really makes us anticipate it even more, coming out in around 9 months. But yeah, those are the 4 films that I would like to highlight from 2020. Like I said, in television, of course, there were so many web series and TV series that came out in science fiction, like Westworld, for example, Altered Carbon, The Mandalorian, of course, if you consider Star Wars to be science fiction, which I will not go into. I will not go into that debate right now. But of course, we have Star Trek Discovery, which I have talked about in a previous episode. It's an excellent series, brilliant. It gets even better every season that progresses. And it's the most biological out of all the series in the franchise, which as a biologist is something that I really appreciate. And that's why I'm going to devote one particular episode to the biology of Star Trek Discovery. Now, I said at the start of the video that I don't have much to say about science fiction literature that came out in 2020 because I didn't really get to go to the bookstore and look at the science fiction section as much as I usually do. However, that is not to say that I was not able to use the break during the lockdown to my advantage in terms of catching up to sci-fi that I should have read a long time ago. And I was finally able to do that. I was able to read this one, Severian of the Guild, which is more popularly known as the Book of the New Sun by none other than Gene Wolfe, one of the best science fiction authors ever. Now, if you haven't heard of the Book of the New Sun, it's considered widely to be a classic in the science fiction, in the fantasy genres, or in the science fantasy, hybrid genre. It is a story set in a future setting that you can argue to be Earth. In fact, it's called Earth, spelled as URTH. There are many indications that it can be a future Earth. Of course, that's going to be up to your interpretation. It's considered science fantasy because it has a lot of fantasy trappings, like some sort of magical properties and sorcery, and things that cannot be explained by science, things that are supernatural. But there are also a lot of science elements. And that's the really fascinating thing about the world building that Gene Wolfe was able to do in this particular series, which consists of 4 books. It won a lot of different awards, and it is widely considered to be, again, one of the best in these genres. Its lead character is Severian, who is fascinating because he's unlike probably any other science fiction character. He's not in the vein of any of the major ones that you would be able to identify from sci-fi. He's a torturer, first and foremost. He's a torturer and executioner. He has an eidetic memory, but he is an unreliable narrator. That's the other great thing about it. He can be considered to be an unreliable narrator. He lies a lot, even though he has a strong sense of honor and justice. Very fascinating character. I can only imagine how this would be translated into a film or a series, but I would love to see one, given the right director and the right actor. But really, what's aside from the character itself and the other characters surrounding him, what's fascinating is the amount of world building that Gene Wolfe has been able to put into this future Earth, where you see a hybridization of sorcery, of magical artifacts, and outer space, and robots, androids, and laser weapons, and all of these things that you usually attribute to science fiction. And I even used some of the passages in this book that talk about genetic engineering, particularly of the human race, to result in different offshoots of the human species, and of space exploration in my biology of science fiction course. First of all, I wanted my students to know about these 4 books by the great Gene Wolfe, but I also wanted to highlight certain passages about the idea of exploring space, humanity expanding in a cosmic diaspora, which is one way by which the human species could become a new species, according to many biologists, and I sort of agree with it. And so there's a lot of wonder to be gotten from this book, and it's written excellently. Gene Wolfe is a fantastic writer. He has no peers in terms of his ability to evoke emotions and images through the words that he uses, which are almost song-like in their or poem-like in their fluidity and their beauty. There are no adequate words to describe how beautifully Gene Wolfe writes. So I would invite you to spend time reading these 4 novels. They're quite dense. They're not very easy to read, but your patience will be rewarded. So if you like this discussion, which was admittedly brief, but you'd like to see more on science fiction, popular culture, and everything in between, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in this new year of 2021. See you again soon!